So as some of you may have noticed, I've missed posting a couple of these lecture videos. Just had technical problems every now and then. Well, one of the other things that those videos showed you is what we've talked about before, linguistic areas of refuge. So you can see they're, as we've talked many times, very often in areas that are more difficult to kind of get to. More specific example, if you look at within mountains, because mountains, well, they isolate people, right? So languages are more likely to develop, but also they're more difficult for neighboring countries to come in and kind of, well, make populations assimilate to whatever that other dominant culture was. These are areas that used to be part of the former Soviet Union, and Russia does actually come in here pretty regularly and kind of throw its weight around militarily, but it hasn't been able to actually force these different cultures to completely assimilate like it has through most of the rest of Russia. This chapter talked quite a bit about languages and climate, not just on pronunciation, but about how different languages that come from different specific physical geographies will often have more words. We use the example of, well, why don't we have more words for snow in Minnesota since we get so much? Maybe we just haven't hung out here long enough to develop them. But Spanish words meaning mountains and hills, as you can see, a very wide range, right? Wide range. And the landscapes that that Spain colonized very often had very similar landscapes. Very often when people will move from one area of the earth to the other, unlike in the United States, when people move, they usually move for better weather. Most places in the world, when people move, they move to where it has similar weather to what they're used to. All right, cultural landscapes. Just a reminder, cultural landscape is just a real broad term, meaning, places that humans have affected how they look, right? And it can mean lots of very specific things like actual physical signs that are more than just symbolic or metaphorical, they're just actual signs. I'm going to talk a bit about toponyms. They're an interesting concept. Let's see. It's interesting because the field of geography talks a lot about conflict and kind of how space is contested. They'll often use these types of phrases, and how you could see this in the cultural landscapes around us, but we usually just don't think about it. So for example, things like official signs for places, while in the rest of the world, very often, example was used in the book of the Kurdish people in Iraq and also in Turkey. Well, the Kurdish people overlap a number of different countries. If they were united as one, they would be the size as all other countries that are in that area, but they have been split up, and they've had different amounts of kind of rights through time. So in Iraq, for example, there's a bit of a strong, the Kurdish part of Iraq is relatively separate from the rest of Iraq, and so they're able to have their own laws and retain their customs and whatnot. The Kurdish population in Turkey, they're of a different circumstance. Turkey, well, this was the center of the Ottoman Empire, right? And we talked about how empires tend to force populations within them to assimilate. So the Kurdish population have been under this pressure for hundreds of years. In modern day, there's been kind of ups and downs as far as how much they could use their own language, right? In the past, there have been times when it has been against the law to even teach their own language, yet they persisted and they kept on using their own language. More recently, they've fought for different rights to use their language, use it for signs, things like that. Another example in the book was the use of Gaelic. I think I got an image here. Gaelic. there's Ireland itself, the northern part especially, was colonized by the British, right? And so when it comes to power and control, well, historically the British, similar to again other empires, they would try to force their populations to assimilate. But there's been an upswelling over the years of places wanting to kind of re-embrace their older cultures, and if that comes from utilizing their language again or mixing them together, right? The final example of the type we'll talk about was actually in Quebec about the use of English. I think we talked before about, of course, they use English and French on signs and things, but there are plenty of people in Quebec who feel like it should be French only. And there's actually referendums pretty regularly where they're looking at whether they should break away and form their own country. These have not been successful so far, but you never know. Some of the ways that these kind of contested spaces, these kind of fights for space and for expressing yourself, a little area in geography that is very popular is actually the study of graffiti, because graffiti is very much an outward sign of that. You can see different populations, sometimes different ethnicities, sometimes just different members of gangs and things like that. They'll tag areas, right, to show what areas are their area, and a lot of people will have specific signatures that they will do again, but then they get painted over by the businesses, or someone else comes in and puts their own mark over it, right? And so this is one of the better examples of this struggle actually happening, because you might notice it day after day if you see the same landscapes. If graffiti was, if it was a language, it'd be a dialect, right? Dialect, because it does have its own, these highly stylized symbols and whatnot. And this is a Irish gang, I believe. Do I got it on another slightly bigger? Irish gang. I don't know if people know what grot is. Ever heard that term, grot? Kind of means like garbage, like garbagey. Well, as you can see, there's a lot going on here, right? And very often graffiti, and the study of it, takes a long time, and someone has to really kind of be a bit embedded in that culture to really understand all that's going on. Just some more linguistic landscapes. All right, toponyms. Toponyms, very interesting topic. Let's see, what can I say about toponyms? Toponyms are just, ways to describe places, right? And toponyms are words that have a very specific meaning. So for example, Winter Place, Colorado, right? Well, you may not think about it, but a lot of cities are named purposely in ways to try to kind of sell a place. Often places will change their name because they're trying to sell their place. And so naming your city Winter Place, right? That's an effort for you to, for them to try to give you a specific image that they're trying to sell, right? As this is a ski resort. And so they're hoping that name will connote a specific feeling. It happens a lot in cities, and it's kind of interesting how it's changed through time. Let's see what I got another example here. The book talks about New England in terms like corners or center will be put with the city, right? And the geography of that spreads out. This is center used as town name, as suffix, prefix, right? So New England obviously has a lot, the most, right? But through time, these populations are a lot of the populations that came through this way, and they brought their different name conventions with them, right? So, for example, locally we have Brooklyn Center, right? It has center in the name. Uh, there was a big time where cities specifically, let's say the early days of urbanism in the US, cities wanted to kind of give themselves a name that would make them seem like, well, like they're the center, right? That they're an important place. In early America, before it was really largely urbanized, it was mostly rural and agricultural. Cities would often try to put city in the name itself, right? It's like we're Carson City, you know, and it was a way to say, even if they weren't a big city, like Carson City is like, how big of a city is it? But they want people to think, you know what, we got to go to a city to get whatever, to do this thing we want to do in cities, so go to Carson City. Through time, though, after everywhere urbanized, and then all of a sudden we had kind of suburbanization happening. Places wanted to change their names. They wanted to put something like Park at the end of their name. So instead of next to Brooklyn Center, we have Brooklyn Park, right? And when you put a park in the name, well, that's a specific effort to try to invoke a feeling of, you know, oh, this place will be like a park that we're going to be living in. There's been lots of that type of thing. A lot of suburbs specifically, they would add the term heights, right? Falcon Heights, right? Columbia Heights. Well, that must be the nice area of town, right? People will kind of just assume cities aren't named in a kind of marketing manner like this, but especially newer ones, and in the US, most of our cities compared to the rest of the world are quite new. Very often they are picked in that way. Let's see. Make sure I didn't miss anything. Many of the names within the United States come from older traditional indigenous names for places, which makes a lot of sense. As well, you know, geography is the field of map making. As someone who's made many maps and looked through many old maps, as you look through them, well, as old map makers were mapping different areas, when they wouldn't look up the local indigenous names for things, the names that they picked were often extremely random. Very often they could have like explicit racist names for things. A lot of geographers remapping areas of the South, they were stuck in these quandaries where they're like, I'm not gonna type that name onto a map. I'm gonna name that thing a new thing, right? And then they just become so commonly used that we forget their lineage often, right? Yosemite. Sometimes, obviously, names, I mentioned an example about how there are names that just aren't acceptable anymore. This was kind of one of those cases where a lot of people were studying, the Calhoun that Lake Calhoun was named after, only to find out that it's some dude who was never even from here, didn't really have anything to do with Minnesota. He also was a terrible bigot, right? So there was a movement for a while to change the name of what had been Lake Calhoun to Bidé-Makaska, right? There's lots of places that are kind of moving in that direction, right? Especially since we have this rich range of names that already exist for so many places and things. It's like, well, why not switch it? And that's not just the kind of thing that's happening in the US, you know. I would say around the world, there's kind of a movement toward finding older indigenous terms for different places. The other example that the textbook talks about is, in Spain, well, they say the Iberian Peninsula. I feel like students don't often know what the Iberian Peninsula is. Iberia is just Spain and Portugal together, right? You have this kind of one landmass. People refer to it as Iberia because culturally and geographically they're close proximity and have a lot of similarities. Mentioned before that cultures and languages, if there's land barriers, right? And so you have mountains right here, and then body of water completely surrounding it. So together, the Iberian Peninsula is a coherent entity that is often referred, even though technically you could just say Spain and Portugal. Well, anyway, Spain and Portugal. Well, there was 700 years of Moorish rule. The Moors, not on this map, but down here in northern Africa. And there's been, when we talk about the contesting of space and the battling for space and how this is in names and things. Well, each dot is one Arabic toponym. As you can see, well, I would say the areas that kind of held out Moorish rule have a bit more. But Spain through time, probably people have heard of, the Spanish Inquisition and the church kind of taking over the landmass and pushing out the Moors. I would say past 20 to 30 years, a lot of the different populations of this area have been, at the time that this happened, they were forced to convert. And there was a lot of pressure to convert because they were killing people if they didn't, right? And doing other things to people. So people converted, and then a thing happened culturally where people were being accused of being false converts, of not really converting, and people, they're afraid of being accused of being a false convert, so they worked extra hard to really erase anything that would associate them and their communities to the old Moorish Empire, right? And so that was a cultural thing that happened over hundreds of years, and it's only the past 20, 30 or so years, maybe a little bit more, a little less, that places have been trying to kind of retrace their history, because when this happened, when Spain and Portugal became Christian, it very much changed the landscape of this area, right? I guess is what I'm trying to say. Let's see if there's anything else I'm forgetting. There's a section in our book about the Alhambra, which is down here. It's a very lovely old Moorish castle. I feel like I'm forgetting something from this topic, but just gonna move on. More examples of places changing their names through time. India, they were a colony of Britain for a long time, right? And a lot of different names of places were basically bad translations of what the local older names were, that British people making the maps just didn't care that much about getting the details right? That's why as you look at these names, a lot of them look pretty similar, but there's been a big shift. They decolonized in 1947, so this has been happening for a good while. But very often as the names change, there's like committees involved in deciding, what will be the proper name? Is that what we for sure want it to be? Stuff like that. Again, these are good examples of the fighting over space, right? And the fighting over identity. I remember what I was going to say about Spain. A lot of the populations, when it became Christian, as I said, the populations were forced to convert. They didn't leave; they stayed there. And so, when it comes to something like ethnicity and history, the populations there have started to want to research their ancestral roots, and that research has led them to a kind of reemergence of Islam in the area, especially the south of Spain. There's also a section in this chapter looking at controversies about naming things like stadiums. You know, we have kind of a lot of that going on in Minnesota, of course, but a lot of that going on in lots of places because it's a way for stadiums. Stadiums are not cheap things, right? They need a good amount of money, so very often they will want some amount of corporate support. But also on the same time, sports stadiums are not put out with zero amount of public money, which is the tax money that we all pay, right? And so again, that's another kind of contested space because, well, the Hewart H. Humphrey Metrodome. You guys maybe vaguely remember that we used to have a Metrodome here. Hewart H. Humphrey was not a corporate giant, was not a business. It was a politician from Minnesota. Was vice president, right? Well, one of the most successful politicians from Minnesota. But the stadium that replaced the Hewart H. Humphrey Metrodome was not named after any politician, right? Wasn't named after any kind of wonderful leader of anything, right? It's U.S. Bank Stadium. It's like, well, it's a name. Oh, one of the other things I wanted to mention, the book, these textbooks will throw out terms that they don't really define that well. And so as I was rereading it today, I read a part where it talked about how the naming of stadiums, naming it something like U.S. Bank Stadium, is the neoliberalization of public space. And I was like, I bet students do not know what neoliberalism is, that you would then read that and know what the book is trying to say. Has anyone heard that term before? Yeah. Well, were you able to define it?
Yeah, it's like neoliberalism kind of states that the world is becoming increasingly interdependent and that democracy is spreading. So, like as that happens, public spaces sort of need to be commodified because we're interconnected and interdependent, kind of at a greater or to a greater degree, so to speak.
Well, you threw in some stuff about democracy and whatnot, which is like, the other stuff worked a bit. I know people will see this term kind of liberal, and they'll just kind of think neoliberalism, does that just mean like new kind of liberals? And it's like, no, it's not. This is a term that is mostly used in Britain. In Britain, the term liberal doesn't mean the same thing as it does here. Doesn't mean like, vote Democratic or whatever. It means like, the closest thing that I could think of here would be a libertarian, right? So when they say someone is a liberal or neoliberal, what they mean is that person or that discourse in this case, if the discourse is neoliberal, it is saying that the business way of doing things is the correct way and not the democratic way or any other ways, right? It's the market is the answer for all. That's what neoliberalism means in it. And so when the book talks about the neoliberalism of public space, it will talk about, well, like our big U.S. Bank Stadium, right? And it has a whole bunch of space around it. Well, someone who would be arguing against neoliberalism would say that this should be a place that belongs to everybody and everyone could get together and kind of speak their mind and do what they want to do. And you have public interaction that is the core of a functioning democracy. They'd make these types of arguments. And they would say, well, what happens, the rest of the world, for example, will very often have large public squares where people can debate or have protests or a whole range of things, right? In the US, we don't really have public spaces so much like that. They've been very commodified. If you're going to be going to the U.S. Bank Stadium and hanging out in the space there, you better be doing US Bank Stadium business, right? You're there to get your ticket to go see a game. You're going to be in a line to buy a hot dog. You're going to be here to buy stuff. And if you're not in the middle of buying stuff, get out of here, right? That would be the argument of people who are saying that, well, the naming of sports stadiums and taking away of public space, right? In the U.S., closest thing we have to public space, parks, kind of. Not that there's a lot of kind of social interaction going on there. But places within cities where the rest of the world usually has lots of these places within cities where people can congregate and do things. We just don't have so much of those. It's one of the many reasons why when there are protests locally, they'll be on the roads, right? Because it's like a place that exists that people can do it, right? Go out to the highway if they have to, right? Because we just don't kind of make those spaces for people here in the way that some would want them to be. All right. And it's interesting because when naming things after different businesses, it runs the same risk of, when Lake Calhoun was named and nobody thought to themselves, it was given that name because that was someone who had political power over in Washington, D.C., hadn't anything to do with Minnesota. And at the time that the naming was done, nobody seemed to care to look into, who is this dude we're naming this lake after? Has he ever been here? Has he ever done anything for the state? Why are we naming it after this guy? So it runs the risk of, well, if it's a corporate name, I don't know if you're all too young to remember when there was a company called AmeriQuest, which was a big lender, and they had tons of money. And there was like a 10-year period of time, this is like everything was named AmeriQuest to this and AmeriQuest that. And then when they went out of business and they folded, all of a sudden you have all these places that have these names that are defunct. All right? All right. Well, I think I'm going to go through some of the quiz questions that students often get wrong, just to kind of check in with everybody about all this stuff. Not these questions. Gonna do the normal standard thing, where I'm just gonna read it and we're gonna see what people think. Many blank toponyms are found in modern Spain. Are they French, Portuguese, Arabic, English? Oh, Arabic. We were just talking about that, right? Southern Spain, the Alhambra, not that area. All right, well, you'll get that one right now. What part of the United States are generic toponyms such as corners or center often found? The Mid-Atlantic, the South, New England, the Rocky Mountains. Didn't see a lot of hands. This is what the whole conversation about New England, right? Right, the map of toponyms. All right, just a few more. Which country long suppressed the Kurdish language but has been easing these restrictions as a part of its effort to join the European Union? What are we talking about? Cyprus, Iraq, Turkey, Russia. All right, looks like you guys got that one. All right. Oh yeah. Well, we didn't talk about this today, but we talked about it last time. English is particularly abundant in words describing, number one, rough terrain, mountains, wetlands and flowing streams, types of snow. Yeah, you guys got that one too. All right. Oh, this is another one from one of the first lectures on this topic. All right. The languages of which family of languages, the languages of which family were imposed on the colonies of Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Portugal? Was it the Sino-Tibetan family of languages? The Niger-Congo set of languages? Indo-European set of languages? Afro-Asiatic? Yeah. I feel like that one was like a little harder, but not super hard. This one was also from the first lecture, so you may not remember. One language becomes extinct or dies out approximately, is it every day? Every 2 weeks? Every year? Every decade? It's actually every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, a language bites the dust, usually from the few remaining members who use it dying and the younger generation just not using it. All right. A person of Latin American descent living in Texas may say, "Estoy muy upset," which translates into, "I'm very upset." This is an example of what linguistic phenomena? It's a tougher one. Is it lingua franca? Is it Spanglish? Is it cultural maladaptation? Esoglossus. It is Spanglish. Spanglish. Talked about very briefly in our book. Yeah, that's why the students don't get this one. But you guys will get it. That's what you get for coming to class. Let's see. I'm going to check real quick how many more of these. Oh, just 2 more. All right. How can a holy book make one language more powerful than another? All right. Is it because the language is used in ceremonies? The language is used by religious leaders? The language is standardized? The language is fluid? It's that standardization, right? Very often in many cultures, especially when books were relatively new, very often the only book people would have access to would be a holy book, and it wouldn't even necessarily be theirs. It would be like a community's one book. And so as people would often like write their own versions and whatnot. Printing press took a while to get going, but that really standardized. One of the few things that were published in a text form became kind of like, well, you know, if you think about a dictionary and how that is in a book, that is now these words are defined this way for a set amount of time, right? All right, last one. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was instrumental in the diffusion of which language eastward to the Pacific Ocean? So this is, well, Trans-Siberian Railroad, right? Which of these language did it spread across a region? Was it German? Kazakh? Austro-Hungarian? Russian? Oh, you guys all got that one. Yes, again, that was from the first week. All right, well, that's that chapter. Let's see. Our next chapter, chapter 5, we've got a few minutes still. So I will maybe get a start. Race and ethnicity, which are often kind of confused, conflated, brought together, but they're different things. There's some overlap, I guess. So ethnicity, right? Well, the reason why these things are different, well, is I'll read it. Ethnicity shapes our social interactions, our relative power, our identity, our landscapes, and more. Race is a social construct and also shapes our landscapes and social intersection. So when it says that it's a social construct, you know, when geographers are kind of asked questions about race or like mapping racial identity, that that's not something that really kind of makes sense because it's a definition that people create, right? Because if we're talking about something like something as simple as skin color, that just depends on how long a population has been in an area that gets a certain amount of sun. When they've looked at the DNA of the very first people in Britain, they were actually very dark complected, because of course we've all come from Africa, right? And skin pigment, well, as you move away from the equator, it lightens, mostly because, well, a fetus needs vitamin D. There's less sunlight as you go north, and so having lighter skin allows vitamin D to come in. And then the opposite is true. Any populations, again, this happens like within a few thousand years. If a people move to even just a slightly different amount of sunlight, whether it's more or less, that population, their pigment will change. And then obviously darker pigment is a protection from the sun, right? This is one of the reasons why, well, you get a lot of Europeans who have moved to Australia, or even maybe the sun belt of the US, they get all kinds of skin cancer and stuff, right? There's all kinds of problems. If any of you, have gotten a good sunburn. So that's one of the reasons why when it comes to geography and something like race, for geographers, it makes sense to talk about the impacts that identifying as race have, but as a category of biology or something, it just isn't really something that makes sense. All right? Let's see here. Some longer definitions here. I'm not going to read them out. Another term that's very often used in this chapter is minority, right? Minority. But minority, again, can mean a wide range of things, right? Minority populations usually come about from those populations moving to places that they are not the majority, right? More so than other populations moving to an area and making that population a minority because so many of them have moved in. As you know, a combination of those things has happened historically in the United States, right? Let's see, percentage of foreign-born here. Well, you can see populations who are migrating in tend to live on the coasts, and in general, even on coasts, like larger cities, usually places that were large enough to have a sizable population of that minority, so that population, when they're coming in, have a place that they feel at home, right? And that they can then take their time in learning the local language and things like that. Let's see. Well, talked about race before. I feel like racism is a term I don't need to define. You've probably heard it. Maybe the term racialize you haven't heard before. That term usually means you'll have a group that is in power in a place, and